Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Falk. I bet you thought that we were finished with epidemics. Well, maybe not eliminated, but at least less threatening. Well, not so fast. According to the Surgeon General, the United States has a growing epidemic of loneliness and isolation. And one reason for this, according to author and New York Times columnist David Brooks, who joins us today from Philadelphia, is that we just aren't very good at seeing and understanding others. David's latest book is How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. He's also a commentator on PBS's NewsHour and NPR's All Things Considered. And here joining me in our studio is Robert Hall. He's a frequent guest of our program and an expert on relationships. He's the author of This Land of Strangers, The Relationship Crisis That Imperils Home, Work, Politics, and Faith. Gentlemen, let's get started with our conversation. I like to be an optimist, but I pulled this quote from your book. You wrote, "We're living in the middle of some sort of vast emotional, relational, and spiritual crisis." I don't think of you as being so pessimistic.
Yeah, I'm not by temperament, but reality is reality, and you can't hide from it. And Robert and I have both been dealing and trying to address this crisis for years now. And my book is really an attempt to say that in brutal times, the people I admire most are what you might call defiant humanists, that they will lead with respect, they will lead with trust. And understanding other people, which is the essential act of being a good practical human being, is to understand the people around you and make them feel seen, heard, and understood. It starts with being open-hearted, with being a good person. But it also requires skills and being a great conversationalist, knowing how to disagree well, knowing how to listen, knowing how to reveal vulnerabilities at the appropriate pace, knowing how to ask for and offer forgiveness, knowing how to sit with someone who's suffering. These are all concrete skills, just the way carpentry is a skill and learning to skate is a skill. And so in the book, I just try to walk people through these skills. And in very concrete terms and practical terms, here's how you can make the people around you feel seen, valued, heard, and understood. And that's our way of fighting against this crisis of relationship and connection that Robert and I write about.
We're going to get to some of those skills in a few minutes because, in a sense, this is a how-to book. But, Robert, did we lose those skills? Did we have them? I remember my father saying, shake hands and look someone in the eye.
Well, one of the things that happened is those skills were very much in decline. Atrophy might be the word. And then along comes COVID, of all things. And as a result of COVID, we became more reliant on technology, which was a great thing. But we also atrophied in terms of our relationships. And we've all seen all the statistics that concern us, the deaths that have occurred, the desperation around relationships. We've certainly seen the loss of friendships, the number of people who quadruple, who have no close friends. We see all of those things occurring. And technology actually, during COVID, allowed us to survive. But it also made us relationally atrophied. And, with all the bad stuff that was going on, I love the John Ortberg quote. He said, "We'd be better to eat Twinkies together than to eat broccoli alone." Well, unfortunately, during COVID, we ate Twinkies alone. And as a result of that, we've seen this muscle called relationship and social skills really atrophy. And it now requires of us to be more intentional about those skills and capabilities.
So you mentioned COVID, but David, we certainly are living in a time of political polarization. And I suspect that that's had an impact on how we converse and communicate and have relationships, connect with our fellow men and women.
Yeah, why is there so much sadness around? Why is there so much meanness around? And I'd say there are a lot of different stories you could tell about that. One, as Robert said, is the social media story. Social media is driving us all crazy. Two is a political polarization story. Three is a sociology story. We're not active as much as we used to be in civic life. I would tell another story, which is the simplest story, which we just don't treat each other with consideration or respect in the concrete circumstances of life. And so being considerate and kind requires the ability to know where other people, what they want and what they need from you at that moment. We're sinful creatures. And we have to, if we're going to live in a democracy with other sinful creatures, that we need to do moral formation. We need to form each other. And moral formation used to be the central job of schools, for example. The National Education Association, they thought our primary job in education is to improve the character of our students. As one headmaster put it, we want to produce students who are acceptable at a dance, invaluable at a shipwreck. And so people you can count on when the chips are down. And schools have stopped doing that. Now their job is to teach professional skills or to get kids into Harvard or Stanford or whatever. And so they've narrowed what they teach. And so it's all utilitarian, and it's all about the self. And so I think, we laugh. In the 50s, they had these clubs at school called the Courtesy Club. And it was to teach you how to be courteous to other people. And now we think that's kind of woo-woo and naive, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe moral formation, which is the act of teaching people how to be considerate to others in the concrete circumstances of life, maybe that's actually not a soft and woo-woo thing, but a hard and practical thing.
Robert, you do a lot of work with corporations, and there's such an emphasis there now to be politically correct. I mean, how do you bridge that gap without insulting someone, but trying to make a constructive pathway to being polite and with others?
It's interesting. I think the number one challenge of the CEOs and C-suite executives that I work with, both in business, nonprofits, churches, synagogues, wherever you are, is how to deal with people who don't get along, who have very different agendas. And so it seems to me that political correctness right now became one of those dividing mechanisms that has caused people to struggle to communicate. And so one of the things I find, one of the terms one CEO I've worked with use is constructive dissatisfaction. And that means, how do you work with stakeholders who have very different agendas, maybe more polarized than ever today? And the role of leader is not to tell them all what they want to hear, but how do you work it out? One of the things he says, I've got stakeholders, I've got customers, and I've got employees. If I gave any one of those groups all they want, we would go out of business. So the ability to work with hard conversations with people who have differences, it seems to me, is really crucial. Unfortunately, in our politics these days, that doesn't seem to be rewarded.
Recently heard Ken Hirsch, who's head of the
Yes.
Bush Center here in Dallas, and he was talking about when you communicate and have a conversation with someone, don't always look at the topic as it's this way or it can be this way and. And I wonder, David, if you might, how do you react to what Ken said?
Yeah, well, when you're having hard conversations, the first thing to remember is to find the gem statement. So we may be disagreeing about something in our company, but we probably both want what's best for our company. And so if we can keep returning to that thing we agree on, the gem statement, then we'll save the relationship amid hard times. The second thing to deal with disagreement is to stand in their standpoint. When somebody comes at me with critique, my instinct is to get defensive and say, hey, I'm one of the good guys. But my job is to ask them 3 or 4 times in different words, tell me more about your point of view. What am I missing here? And if I go and ask them 3 or 4 or 5 times to keep going deeper and deeper, new things will emerge. And I might not agree with them, but the very act of asking those questions is a sign of respect. And there's a very good book called Crucial Conversations. And the authors of those books say, in any conversation, respect is like air. When it's present, nobody notices. When it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. So we want to show respect in that conversation and get in the other person's point of view. And then the final thing for dealing with hard conversation is to find the disagreement under the disagreement. If we're disagreeing about a marketing strategy, or if we're disagreeing about the Middle East, what is the core philosophical difference deep down that we really disagree about? And if we can, instead of fighting with each other, if we can try to understand why we're disagreeing, that's just a much more constructive way to approach a hard conversation.
But David, how do you handle it if you're in a conversation where the person that you're with really just has a brick wall?
Yeah, I have this distinction in the book between diminishers and illuminators. And diminishers stereotype, they ignore, they're not curious about you. They make you feel small and unseen. And illuminators are curious about you. They ask you questions. They make you feel respected and lit up. And some people are just going to be diminishers. And when I'm with somebody I think is a brick wall, the first thing I do is I try to lead with some little vulnerability and to see if that person is going to lead with a vulnerability back. And if they do, then we've opened a door. If they haven't, they've slammed the door. And then I try to lead with curiosity. I just try to ask them something about their life. So, for example, I no longer ask people, what do you believe about this? Instead, I ask, how did you come to believe this? And that gets them talking about a person who shaped their values or an experience. And that's a door of curiosity. And they're either going to open that door or they're going to slam it shut. And if they keep slamming it shut, I'm afraid I have not discovered a way to turn a diminisher into an illuminator. There are some people who are just toxic. There are just some people who are not going to be reciprocal with you. And you just have to learn to deal with that, I'm afraid. It's an ugly fact of reality.
Give me an example of, and I think you have a few in your book, but someone who's just epitomizes being an illuminator.
Yeah, I mean, for example, there was a novelist named E.M. Forster who lived 100 years ago. And his biographer wrote of him, he listened to people with such intensity that they had to be their most honest, best, and creative self. Imagine how good it would be to listen to someone with that kind of intensity. There was a place called Bell Labs, and at Bell Labs, famous research facility, there were some researchers who were way more innovative than the others. And so the people want to understand, why are these people so much more productive and creative? And they checked out their educational background, and they checked out their IQ, and they couldn't find a reason. And then they realized that the people who were most creative were in the habit of having breakfast or lunch with an electrical engineer named Harry Nyquist. And Nyquist would get inside their heads. He would ask them the questions. He would accompany them as they worked through their problems. And he made them better by getting inside their minds and seeing the world from their perspective. So Harry Nyquist was an illuminator.
And what we're seeing with, and I guess it's going back, but the remote workplace, it makes it a lot harder to have those type of relationships, doesn't it?
It really does. And, you look at the forces that we're dealing with now, particularly post-COVID, work from home, the ability to shop online, all the different things to be educated through online learning. All of those things take away from the opportunity to be face-to-face. And I go back to what David just said. I love that word, illuminator. One of the statements I heard recently from someone, a social psychologist, that said all a child really wants to see is that their parents' eyes light up when they walk into a room. That's illumination, and it brings out a different kind of energy. And as David says, it's not everybody responds to that. But if we can be attempting to seek that, if that can be our intent in a discussion that is relational, I think it's very powerful, and our odds go up greatly that it'll work.
And that gets back to that notion, David, of friendship, where, as I said in the open, that is becoming a real crisis of people who don't have many friends, loneliness. How do we change that, especially among young people, where you're seeing a rise in suicides and mental illness?
When we're meeting someone, we're unconsciously asking ourselves a question: am I a priority for this person? Am I a person for this person? And the answer to those insecurities the answers will come from our eyes before any words come out of their mouth. Since you guys are in Dallas, let me tell a story about Waco, which by Texas standards is not too far away from where you are. And so I'm in a diner in Waco with a woman named LaRue Dorsey, who's this 93-year-old lady who had been a teacher much of her career. And she struck me as a tough, stern disciplinarian. And I was a little intimidated by her. And into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy is a pastor. He has a church that serves the homeless. And he comes up to our table, and he grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders and shakes her way harder than you should shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Mrs. Dorsey, you're the best, I love you, I love you. And that stern disciplinarian lady that I'd been talking to suddenly turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. And as Robert said, just by beaming that warm light of attention on her, Jimmy brought out a different version. When you see somebody, you bring out different versions of themselves with your eyes. It's a creative act. If you see potential in me, I'll see potential in myself. And partly that's just Jimmy's warm way of being in the world. But there's a more profound lesson here, which is that Jimmy's a pastor, as I said. So when he sees somebody, anybody, he sees somebody made in the image of God. He's looking into the face of God. He's looking at somebody with a soul of infinite value and dignity. He's looking at somebody so important, Jesus was willing to die for their sins. Now, you can be an atheist or an agnostic or a Christian, Jew, Muslim, Buddhist, whatever. But looking at each person you meet with that level of respect and reverence is the first step to seeing them well, to knowing the depth and complexity of each person you meet, and also making them feel warm and respected immediately with your eyes. And so that's just that force of attention is the first moral act of building a friendship.
And for that to work, you have to have trust. You have to have trust in the individual, and I think you have to have trust generally with the environment. And Robert, you've done a lot of work on how Americans have lost trust and faith in not just each other, but some of the institutions, whether it's Supreme Court or military. Won't mention Congress, but
what I find as we've become more divided as a society is we show up with an energy that's adversarial and enemy. I'm amazed. Over and again, politicians say, I'm going to fight for you. Well, that implies that we've got our side and the other side, and that fighting is what's required. What if we said, I'm going to work on your behalf to achieve some higher aim that's really important to you? So it seems to me we will not fix the trust problem until we become reliably relational. And that means showing up with the hope and the intent of working collaboratively, not as enemies.
I'm glad you mentioned showing up, because, David, one section of your book that I particularly appreciated was where you talked about accompaniment, being there, and you gave examples. Like if you say, I've lost someone in my family, how do you respond to situations like that?
Yeah,
David?
accompaniment can start out as little as just casually being around a person. I have friends here where I live in D.C., and they say they like their guests to be lingerable. And that means they're good company. They're the kind of people you just want to linger with around the dinner table after the meal. And that's one thing. The second skill that's super important here, as Robert was saying, when we encounter the stranger or somebody we may disagree with, that's socially just very hard to do. There's vast differences of perspective, and that touch us deep and hard. We're going to get angry. So we need to just be really good conversationalists. And in the book, I talked to a bunch of experts. I tried to pile in a bunch of skills that'll make you a better conversationalist. And there's skills like be a loud listener. I have a buddy, when you talk to him, it's like talking to a Pentecostal church. He's like, yes, preach, amen, yes, I agree. And I love talking to that guy because he's listening so actively, he's burning calories. Another one is don't fear the pause. If I'm saying something important to you, or important to me, or important to both of us, and it's serious, usually I start talking, and then you stop listening halfway through so you can think of what you're going to say. But if you let me talk all the way through to the end and pause for 3 or 4 seconds, then you've heard everything I have said. Another tip is don't be a topper. If you start telling me about the problems you're having with your teenage son, and I say, I know exactly what you're going through. I'm going through the same thing with Tommy. It sounds like I'm just trying to relate. But what I'm really doing is shifting the conversational focus from you onto me so I can talk about myself. And so these are just concrete social skills. And if we're going to deal with these really hard conversations, you just have to get better at these concrete maneuvers. Because when we get angry with each other, our motivations deteriorate. And it used to be we were arguing about politics. Now we just want to show I'm smarter than you. And once your emotions deteriorate, everything you say after that is going to hurt the relationship and not help it. And so you want to stop. When that starts happening, you want to stop it and do something the experts called splitting, where you clarify your emotions, your motivations. I'm not trying to silence your voice. I was just trying to understand your point of view. So you say what you don't want to do, and you say what your intentions really are. And that restarts the conversation. And so you can rebuild even after something hard has been said.
And so to me, if we gain wisdom throughout our lives, if we get wiser, then it seems to me part of that wisdom is to be able to seek relationships and the knowledge and the feelings, the heart that comes from dealing with others. So if we get locked into a place where we say we've learned it all, to me, the wisest people I know say the longer I live and the more I learn, the more I know I don't know. what follows from that, then I need to be in relationship with others who do know, and I need to be open to learn from them.
Well, I think you're looking at my card because, David, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is how would you describe humanistic wisdom?
Yeah, so I used to think wisdom was like Dumbledore or Yoda or Solomon. The wise person is the person who has a maxim you can put on an index card or a book of quotations. But to me, the wise person is the person who can receive, the person who can take the story you're telling and create a hospitable atmosphere so you tell the story so you feel natural to be yourself. And the wise person can take the story you tell and see you in a noble struggle. The wise person can sometimes pull out the hard parts you leave out of your clean tale. And so basically it's an invitation, a tender invitation and a patient invitation to be more fully yourself. And so other people are not going to solve our problems. But one of the things they can do is edit our stories. So we all tell a story about our lives. And we usually tell the story that's most comfortable for us. But sometimes those stories stop working, often because we get causation wrong. We blame ourselves for things that are not our fault, or blame others for things that are our fault. And so a wise person is a story editor. They say, well, I understand this version of your life, but didn't you leave this out? Didn't you leave that out? And they force us to confront reality and tell a more accurate story of our life. And we leave those conversations feeling fantastic because most people never have the chance to tell their life story. And so I met a researcher named Dan McAdams at Northwestern. And what he does is he studies how people tell their life story. And he brings them to the office. He asks them about their high points and their low points and their turning points. And then he says about half the people cry at some point, talking about their lives. And then he gives them some money to help them, compensate them for their time. And a lot of the people just push back the check and they say, I don't want to be paid for this. This has been one of the best afternoons of my life. No one has ever asked me my story before. And that's wisdom. And that's something we can all do. You don't have to have some advanced degree to do that. That's something we can all do, is just try to elicit other people's stories and maybe iron them out a little.
One thing that was in the book that really surprised me, it was a phrase or research by the American Enterprise Institute, which is, as we know, a conservative leaning think tank in the nation's capital. And it showed that lonely people are 7 times more likely than non-lonely people to say they're active in politics. That really surprised me. David, did it surprise you?
Yeah, I guess so. But politics, if you feel lonely and abandoned, politics gives you the illusion that you're in community because you're hating the same people together. You're on the red team or the blue team. Politics gives the illusion that you're taking moral action. You're getting indignant at the other side. Politics gives you the illusion that there's a moral landscape, that there's the good people over here and the bad people over there, and you're involved in a righteous struggle. But these are all illusions. If politics doesn't give you community, you're not tending to the widow, you're not feeding the poor, you're not breaking bread with people. You're just hating the same people. And that's not genuine community. Politics doesn't give you moral action. You're not struggling with the weaknesses of yourself. You're not struggling with your own sins. You're just bashing the other side. And so politics has the appearance of curing your loneliness, but it just lurches you into perpetual culture war and bitterness. And so politics has become a social therapy. Everything is politicized. The sports is now politicized. Late night comedy is politicized. Church and synagogues have become politicized. But it's driving us all crazy because it doesn't give us what we're seeking, which, as Robert said, is those genuine senses of community, a sense that we're moral creatures doing good for the world.
Do you think there needs to be a change, Robert, in perhaps a core curriculum in universities? I mean, we've recently seen what's happening on college campuses now with the Israel-Hamas war. Is it just that people don't know how important it is to really build that human connection?
Well, that gets to the want to and how to. And the term that I would use, that I would think would be really the moniker for that, is relational leadership. And relational leadership doesn't mean being CEO. Relational leadership starts with a decision to move from where I am. That's what leadership, moving from where I am to some other place. And so to me, relational leadership would say this is I happen to believe that relationships are our most valuable and value-creating resource that we have. Relational leadership would say, how do I use my skills, my want to build relationships, and how do I do it not just with my friends, which is also very important. How do I do it with enemies? How do I do it with strangers? David's book hits that so hard and so poignantly. So yes, I think we should be teaching rather than how to get on one side and throw rocks at the other side as, quote, an activist. Let's have activism for relationship building. Let's have activism for all being around some greater purpose.
I hate to do this. David, we didn't talk about how to end the conversation, but that's what I have to do now. Want to thank both of you for joining us. Consider this. 61% of U.S. adults say having close friends is extremely or very important to live a fulfilling life. Yet, consider this. 30% say they have less than 3 close friends. As David and Robert have explained, there's lots of reasons for this. Thanks for being part of our conversation where we talk about things that matter with people who care. I'll see you next time.